When I got the call that my uncle had been arrested again, I wasn't shocked. He had always been the charming, reckless type, one of those guys who seemed to live for trouble, always finding it and never shying away from it. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just another run-in with the law. He was facing a decade in prison, 10 years for possession of over a pound of cocaine. They said it was stuffed in the trunk of his car, packed away as carelessly as if it were groceries. It stung, though. He had sworn he was clean, promised us he'd left his wild days behind. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was walking the straight and narrow now. We'd always been skeptical. Old habits die hard, after all. But a whole pound, none of us saw that coming. My uncle swore up and down that the drugs weren't his, that he'd been set up, that someone was out to get him for good. But whenever we pressed him about it, he'd go quiet, muttering something about how 10 years behind bars was nothing compared to what they would do to him. After the sentencing, my mom called. Her voice was tight, like she was holding it together, and asked if I could go over to his apartment to sort through his stuff. It was just one of those family duties, the kind you can't say no to. I wasn't close to my uncle, but family bonds are strong, and even when you feel you shouldn't, you can't help but feel responsible. With him locked up for the next decade, I volunteered to clear out his place and move his stuff to storage. I wasn't sure why I was so eager to do it, but I guess I felt it was the least I could do. The apartment was a mess, exactly what I'd expected. His kitchen cabinets were crammed with mismatched thrift store pots and pans, each one more scratched up than the last. I could picture him at the stove, a cigarette dangling from his lips, stirring up whatever random meal he'd thrown together in those beat-up pans. The living room looked like a tomb. Ashtrays littered nearly every surface, full of weeks' worth of cigarette butts, and the walls were a sickly yellow, stained from years of constant smoke. Even the light switches had turned the same shade, crusted over with years of grime from his nasty habit. It was obvious he hadn't opened a window in years. I found myself running my fingers along the walls, almost wondering if the yellow residue would come off. It didn't. In one corner of the room was his pride and joy, a collection of Star Trek figurines and posters, neatly arranged on a crooked shelf he'd probably nailed up himself. He'd been a fan for as long as I could remember, always rambling on about episodes I'd never watched and characters I couldn't name. Dozens of plastic figures, all with blank, determined looks, stared at me as I packed up his things. His treasures boxed up and ready to be stashed away. Who knew for how long? It took a few days, but I finally packed up most of the place. 3 trips in my truck, hauling boxes and crates over to the storage unit across town, until the apartment was stripped clean. The only things left were the stained carpet, the nicotine-coated walls, and the broken blinds barely hanging from the windows. There was no chance he was getting his security deposit back. The damage was practically baked into the place. But at that point, it didn't matter. As I was sorting through the last of the kitchen stuff, my hand brushed against something hidden in the shadows of one of the cabinets. I pulled it out and found myself holding a small, worn leather book. The cover was cracked and faded, soft from years of handling, and it smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and marked with the remnants of kitchen chaos, stains, smudges, and scribbled notes everywhere. The entries were all over the place, written without any real order, as if the person who had kept the book had jotted down recipes the moment they'd been thought up, without worrying about any kind of structure. As I flipped through the pages, a strange feeling washed over me. This book could have belonged to my grandfather. He was the one who had brought the family together with his homemade meals, year after year. Every holiday felt anchored by the food he'd made, recipes no one had ever been able to quite replicate. This book might hold the secrets to those dishes, a piece of him that had somehow ended up in my uncle's hands after my grandfather passed. And yet, there was something unsettling about it. The leather felt cold and damp in my hands, and as I turned the pages, a chill ran through me. It felt wrong, almost as if there was more to this book than just family recipes. Curious about the book's past, I decided to show it to my mom. The moment she saw the flowing handwriting on the yellowed pages, her expression softened, and she nodded in recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she murmured, tracing her fingers gently over the ink. She hadn't seen it in years, and when I told her where I'd found it, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. She'd been looking for this book for ages, not realizing that her brother had kept it all this time. As she flipped through the pages, I could sense a wave of nostalgia mixed with something else, maybe a little sadness or even reverence. It was clear this book held a lot of meaning for her, which made me even more determined to make sure it was preserved. "Would it be okay if I kept it a bit longer?" I asked. "I want to scan it, make a digital copy for myself, so we don't lose any of his recipes." My mom agreed without hesitation, relieved that I was taking the time to preserve something she didn't even know was still around. So over the next few weeks, between the usual hustle of my life, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't too concerned with the actual content, more focused on making sure the recipes were clear and readable, not paying much attention to the strange ingredients and cryptic notes scattered throughout. My goal was simple: create a digital copy that would be kept safe for years to come. When I finished, I spent a few hours stitching the scanned images together, assembling them into a smooth digital version. Once it was all done, I returned the original to my mom, feeling a mix of relief and accomplishment. The family recipes were now preserved, and I thought that would be the end of it. But that unsettling feeling I had when holding the old worn leather book didn't leave as quickly as I'd expected. For months after, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been a small side project, something I'd intended to follow up on by actually cooking some of my grandfather's old dishes. But like most side projects, I got distracted by other things, and the book's contents faded to the back of my mind, forgotten for the time being. Then Thanksgiving came around. I made my way over to my parents' house expecting the usual: turkey, stuffing, and all the classic dishes we'd been enjoying for years. But when I walked in, I noticed something was off right away. There was a large bird in the center of the table, perfectly roasted, but it looked strange. It was too small to be a turkey, and the skin was darker, almost rougher than the usual golden brown I was used to seeing. "Nice chicken," I said, thinking they'd decided to try something different this year. My mom just shook her head, her eyes a little distant. "It's not a chicken," she replied quietly. "It's a hen." I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's the difference?" I asked, half smiling, expecting her to just brush it off. But instead of answering, she just stared at me for a moment, her gaze unfocused, like she was deep in thought. For a brief moment, her face looked distant, almost blank, as if I'd asked a question she couldn't quite remember. Then suddenly, she blinked and looked right at me. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, her voice carrying a strange edge. Something about the way she said it made my skin prickle, but I pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the usual cooking chaos. Still, when I glanced back at the bird, a small wave of unease settled over me, nagging at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. After dinner, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen, while my mom was busy clearing the table. "What's going on with Mom tonight?" I asked quietly. He shrugged, brushing it off with a quick wave of his hand. "You know how your mother is," he said with a little smile, as if her odd behavior was just another one of her quirks. He didn't think much of it and moved on with whatever he was doing. But I couldn't shake the weirdness. The whole meal had felt off. The hen, nothing like anything we'd had before, was coated in a sweet, almost nutty sauce that had a faint walnut flavor to it, almost hiding its pale ashen color. The bird rested on a bed of greens I didn't recognize, probably some sort of garnish, paired with perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes, all arranged too neatly, as if it was meant to look a certain way. The whole thing was far too elaborate compared to my mom's usual Thanksgiving style. When she finally sat down, my mom led us in saying grace, her voice soft and filled with reverence. As she began slicing into the hen, a strange spark of excitement flickered across her face, one I wasn't used to seeing. She served us each a portion, her gaze intense as she watched us take our first bites. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but as I chewed, I could tell this wasn't the usual Thanksgiving meal. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't pull apart like the tender turkey or chicken I was used to. Mom kept glancing back and forth between my dad and me, a kind of eager glee in her eyes, as though she was waiting for us to say something. It was unsettling, like she was hoping we would uncover some hidden truth. Finally, I couldn't help myself. "What's got you so excited, Mom?" I asked. Her smile softened, her expression turning warm and affectionate. "Oh, it's just this cookbook you found in Grandpa's things," she said, her voice reverent. "It's like having a piece of him with every meal I make." There was a tone in her voice I hadn't heard in a long time, as if she was talking about something much deeper than just food. I nodded, trying to go along with it. "Tastes good," I said, hoping to ease the tension. I enjoyed it, but honestly, I wished we'd had a more familiar Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't bad, but something about it felt off. I couldn't quite place what it was, and maybe I didn't want to. After we finished, I said my goodbyes and headed home, the unsettling feeling from dinner clinging to me. My mom's excited face kept replaying in my mind, and then there was the hen. Why a hen? Why the pale ashen sauce? There was something almost ritualistic about the way she'd prepared it, a strange precision I'd never seen from her before. The questions lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let me rest. Once I got home, I couldn't shake the weird feeling from dinner. I sat at my desk and opened the scanned file I'd saved to my desktop months ago. The folder had been sitting untouched, but now as I opened it, I could understand why I'd avoided it. The handwriting was dense and intricate, almost like calligraphy, each letter flowing into the next. The words danced across the pages in a strange, whimsical way. I had to squint to make sense of the lines. As I scrolled through the recipes, a chill crept over me. They had unsettling names, more like ancient spells than actual recipes. Mother's Last Supper porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf. Elder's ember bread, hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as though the words themselves carried an eerie energy. Then I found it, the recipe for the dish my mom had made tonight. Ancestors' Offering. The title was written in the same swirling calligraphy, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I read through the description. It was for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, though it didn't sound like any recipe I'd ever seen. The instructions were odd, written in a style that made them seem ancient, as though they were passed down through generations. Each ingredient was listed with a level of detail, as though it carried some sort of secret power. My eyes drifted down to the meat. The recipe specified a hen, not just any chicken. "The body must be that of a mother," it read. A shiver ran through me, recalling the strange insistence my mom had made about the hen, correcting me when I'd called it chicken. I continued reading, the unease settling deeper in my gut. The instructions went on, noting that the hen had to be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce. Something I learned was a type of honeysuckle after a quick online search. And then, as I read further, my heart raced. The recipe said it must be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk yields to night. I thought back to dinner and the way we had all sat down just as the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon. But the final instruction was the worst part, and as I read it, my stomach twisted in disgust. The recipe called for something called ancestor salt. At the bottom of the page, a note explained that this salt was actually a sprinkle of the ashes of those who have returned to the earth, with a warning to use it sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I leaned back in my chair, cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about the pale, ashen sauce that had coated the hen, the faint, sweet scent that lingered in the air. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. Had my mom actually used ashes in the meal? Had she used my grandfather's ashes? I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just some old folklore nonsense. But the image of her beaming as she served us that meal, that strange gleam in her eyes, kept creeping back into my mind. I felt my stomach lurch, bile rising in my throat as the horrifying thoughts settled deeper into my consciousness. A few days passed, and the gnawing unease only grew stronger. I kept telling myself I was probably just overreacting, that the odd details in the recipe were nothing more than some bizarre family tradition I didn't understand. But I couldn't shake the dread that came over me every time I thought about that meal. So I decided to call my mom. I planned everything carefully, trying to sound casual. The last thing I wanted was for her to think I was accusing her of something as insane as putting ashes in our food. I asked about my dad, her gardening, anything to ease into the conversation. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even going so far as to say it was the best we'd had in years. When I finally brought up the recipe book, her voice lit up with excitement. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, genuinely pleased. "I had no idea he'd written down so many incredible recipes. I knew your grandfather's cooking was something special, but having all these dishes recorded, it's like his own little legacy. It's been such a joy to look through." I chuckled, trying to keep my tone light. "I actually looked up that dish you made, Ancestors Offering. Thought maybe I'd try it myself sometime." "Oh, really?" she replied, intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was a bit strange that the recipe specifically calls for a hen, not just a regular chicken, since hens are a lot tougher. And the part that says it should be the body of a mother." I let the words hang in the air, hoping she'd offer some explanation that would make it all seem less, well, sinister. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then quietly she replied, "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." Her voice had dropped, lower now, like she was carefully considering her words. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I decided to press a little further. "I also noticed it calls for something called Ancestors Salt," I said, pretending to be confused, acting like I hadn't read the footnote. "What's that supposed to be?" The silence stretched on, longer this time, until it became a thick, almost suffocating hum in my ears. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I have to go," she whispered, sounding almost dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked, leaving me in a stunned, oppressive silence. I tried calling her back immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. I stared at the blank screen, my stomach tightening. I didn't know whether I was more terrified of what I might learn or of what I already suspected. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually dialed my dad's number, feeling a strong urge to at least check in. When he answered, I told him about the weird conversation with Mom and how off she'd been acting. "She went straight into the garden after you talked," he said, sounding unfazed. "Started tending to her plants and hasn't said a word since." I tried to nudge him a little, asking if he could maybe convince her to talk to me, but he just brushed it off. "You're overthinking it. You know how your mom gets. She gets all sentimental over family stuff. If you keep pushing, it'll just upset her. Give her some space." I nodded, trying to take his advice to heart. "Yeah, I'm all right. You're probably right." After we hung up, I told myself I'd let it go and carried on with my day, chalking it up to one of my mom's usual phases of getting overly attached to sentimental things. She'd always treated family heirlooms like they were something sacred, almost magical. But even so, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That recipe book was still with me, lingering like a shadow. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I sat back down at my computer, opening the digital copy of the recipe book. Part of me knew I probably shouldn't, but I couldn't resist. I let the pages skip to a random section, thinking I'd make something small, harmless even. But as I scrolled, my eyes landed on the very last page, where a recipe titled Elder's Ember Bread stared back at me. The instructions were minimal, yet each word felt heavy, steeped in meaning. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I shook my head, half amused and half uneasy. It all seemed like nonsense, I told myself. Just some old superstitions my grandfather had probably picked up along the way. But something about it made my heart race a little faster. Ignoring the chill creeping up my spine, I printed the recipe and walked it into the kitchen. I'd play along, I figured. It was just bread after all. I glanced over the ingredients for Elder's Ember Bread, feeling time slip away as I found myself moving almost mechanically, like I was following a path laid out long before. My mind seemed to blur, the details of the process slipping into a fog. Yet I couldn't stop myself. I gathered everything, not really thinking, each step drawing me deeper, like I was walking in my grandfather's footsteps. I caught flashes, sweet elderberry and honey, the earthy weight of rye, the smoky scent of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point, I whispered something under my breath, words of thanks to my ancestors that I hadn't even meant to say. The smell of warmed goat's milk filled the air, blending with the creamy, thick butter that browned slowly over low heat. A faint scent of yew ash drifted upward, curling around me like smoke from an unseen fire. By the time I snapped out of it, night had settled in. The kitchen was dark and still. There, sitting on the counter, was the bread, dark and dense, with a blackened crust that gleamed as if it had an unnatural sheen. It looked rich, moist, and as I stared at it, an unsettling sense of pride swelled up inside me. It felt wrong, like some quiet voice in the back of my mind was urging me to feel pleased, telling me I'd done something well. Without thinking, I cut myself a slice and carried it into the living room, driven by some strange need to enjoy my creation. I took a bite, and the bread filled my mouth with an earthy, bittersweet taste, smoky, yet sweetened by a subtle berry flavor. It was unusual, nothing like I'd ever tasted before, but oddly satisfying. As I chewed, a warmth spread deep inside me, like the steady heat of a wood stove. It was comforting, almost intimate, as though the bread itself was warming me from the inside. Before I realized it, I'd finished the entire slice. Not because I'd enjoyed it that much, but because something deep inside me made me feel I had to. When I set the plate down, the warmth stayed with me, a heavy presence that seemed to settle deep within my chest. And in the silence that followed, I could have sworn I felt a faint, rhythmic beat, like a heartbeat, steady and ancient, pulsing just beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the elder's ember bread more often than I intended. I'd find myself in the kitchen, knife in hand, halfway through slicing another thick piece before I even realized I'd gotten up. It was like some quiet impulse was guiding me back to it, late at night, in the stillness of the house. Every time I took a bite, that same deep warmth swelled up inside me, radiating outward like embers burning from a steady fire. But unlike the hen my mom had made, a meal that had left me with a lingering, uncomfortable feeling, the ember bread was different. Each bite carried something I couldn't quite put my finger on, something familiar and almost tender, like love and care embedded in every crumb. The days passed, but the questions didn't fade. I tried reaching out to my mom several times, hoping she'd open up about the recipe book, maybe explain why we both seemed so drawn to these strange dishes. But every time I brought it up, she'd dodge the question, either changing the subject or claiming she was too busy to talk. Since Thanksgiving, she hadn't invited me over for dinner, and the space between us felt like it was growing, slow and steady. Even my dad, when I asked about her, shrugged it off. "She's just going through a phase," he said. But the coldness in her responses, her constant avoidance of the book, made me more certain there was something she wasn't telling me. Still, I kept going back to the ember bread, feeling its quiet pull every evening when the sun dipped low, like I was being guided by something unseen. And each time I took a bite, it started to feel less like food and more like communion, like I was forming a connection that grew stronger with every piece I ate. After weeks of unanswered questions, I decided to reach out to my uncle, who was still in prison. I left a short message, just checking in, letting him know it was his nephew and I'd sent him $100 for commissary. The next day he called back, his voice rough over the line, but thankful. "Hey, thanks for the cash," he said with a dry chuckle. "You know how it is in here. Money makes things easier." We caught up a bit, talking about life. He'd been in and out of prison so often that it had become just another part of his routine. Now in his 60s, he spoke about his time behind bars like it was something he'd made peace with, almost as if he preferred it. "By the time I'm out again, I'll be an old man," he said with a wry laugh. "It's not the worst place to grow old." Then I took a deep breath and brought up the real reason I'd called. "I don't know if you remember, but when I was cleaning out your place, I found this old recipe book," I said. I hesitated for a moment, then added, "I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd get a kick out of it." His response was immediate, and the warm, easy tone of his voice turned sharp, cold. "Listen to me," he said, his words measured and serious. "If you have that book, you need to burn it. Don't keep it." "What?" I blurted, caught off guard. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he snapped back. His voice dropped lower, almost trembling now. "That book, It brings out terrible things in people." He paused, then continued, his words careful, as if he was weighing how much to reveal. "Our grandfather, your great-grandfather, he was into some dark stuff. Stuff you don't just find in a family recipe book. And that book?" He took a slow breath. "That book wasn't even his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother. She gave it to him before he even knew what it really was. My mom used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times." The gravity of his words sank in, and everything I'd been feeling, all the unease and confusion, suddenly clicked into place. "They were used to survive," he continued, his voice quiet now. "You've heard the stories about the Great Depression, about how families did whatever they could to survive. But this?" He exhaled sharply. "These recipes are old, older than what you think. They've been passed down through whispers and rumors, long before anyone wrote them down. But they're not for just any meal. They're for invoking things, bringing things into the world. The kind of things that can take hold of you if you're not careful." My hand gripped the phone tighter, a cold shiver running down my spine as my mind raced back to the ember bread, to the warmth it left inside me, and that strange sense of satisfaction that felt almost like it wasn't mine to claim. "Promise me," he said, his voice trembling now. "Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book casually. Those recipes can keep you alive when you're desperate, sure, but they weren't meant to be used unless you're ready to live with what comes after. Promise me you won't let anyone else make that mistake." A chill settled deep inside me, and the weight of it all finally hit. This wasn't just a family recipe book. It was something else entirely, something far darker than I'd ever imagined. I hesitated for a moment, then told my uncle the truth. I'd already made one of the recipes. I explained the ember bread to him, the earthy sweetness, the warmth that filled me, leaving out the part about how I'd almost felt forced to eat it. He let out a sharp sigh and scolded me, his voice more intense than I'd ever heard it. "You shouldn't have touched that bread, not any of it. Do you understand me?" A pang of guilt hit me. "I know. I'm sorry. I promise I won't make anything else from the book." "Good," he said, his tone softening a little. "But that's not enough. You need to get that book away from my sister, your mom, before she does something she can't undo." I tried to reassure him, told him I'd do what I could, but he cut me off, his voice now cold and serious. "You need to do this. Something bad will happen if you don't." As Christmas neared, I kept in touch with him, paying the collect call fees to keep the conversations going. Every time we talked, we circled back to the book. I'd update him on my progress, or lack of it, how I'd tried visiting Mom, but she'd keep brushing me off with excuses, saying she was too busy or that it wasn't a good time. Each time she seemed colder, more distant, as if the book were casting a shadow over her. One day I decided to show up unannounced. When I knocked on her door, she didn't seem happy to see me. "You should have called first," she said, her smile tight. "It's rude to just show up like this." Her words were stiff, forced. I tried to brush it off, saying I just missed her and wanted to check in. But as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up on me. I scanned the house, hoping to spot the book, but it was nowhere to be found. Each time I came, I left empty-handed, feeling like I was being watched from the shadows as I walked out the door. Every conversation with my uncle grew more urgent, his insistence that I take the book from her becoming desperate. "You have to try harder," he'd say, his voice strained. "If you don't get it away from her, something's going to happen. You have to believe me." And deep down, I did believe him. The memory of the ember bread, the strange warmth, and the subtle pull of that old recipe gnawed at me, warning me that something worse lay hidden in that book. But it was more than that. Something in my mom's voice, her distant gaze, and even her scolding felt wrong. Every time I left her house, I felt a chill settle over me, like I was edging closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Christmas Day came, and despite all the recent tension, I wasn't going to let it stop me. I packed the gifts I'd bought for them into my car and drove over, hoping that the holiday might ease some of the strain between us. When I knocked, she opened the door and gave me a quick, half-hearted hug. The smell of baked ham and sweet glaze wafted out, thick and rich, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd set aside the strange recipe book and gone back to her usual cooking. I felt myself relax a little, hoping the day wouldn't be as tense as I'd feared. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around for any sign of him. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off. "Got a new gadget he's playing with. You know him." She motioned to the dining room where plates and holiday decorations were already set up. "Why don't you sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I hung my coat and glanced back at her. She was already busying herself with the table, moving in stiff, mechanical motions. There was no warmth in her, no familiar comfort. It was as if she was physically there, but somehow absent. Not wanting to argue with her on Christmas, I placed my gifts under the tree with the others and sat down at the dining table. My plate was set before me, silverware arranged perfectly on either side. But the emptiness of it, the way it all felt so formal and disconnected, left a strange weight in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, looking down the hallway to the garage. He'd usually be the first to greet me, especially on a holiday. The silence from him was off-putting. "He'll come when he's ready," my mom called from the kitchen, her voice carrying into the dining room. "He had a big breakfast, so he'll join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something about that response didn't sit right with me. It wasn't like Dad to skip a Christmas meal no matter the reason. A nagging thought pulled at the back of my mind. Maybe it was the book again, clouding my judgment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. "I'll go say hi to him," I said, getting up from the table. Before I could even take a step, she appeared in the doorway with a large ham on a silver platter. The meat was dark and glossy, almost burnt, the thick glaze covering every cut she'd made in the skin. The bones stuck out starkly from the center, pale against the charred flesh. "Sit down," she said, her tone firm and unexpectedly sharp, a touch of irritation slipping through the usual holiday warmth. "This is a special meal. We should enjoy it together." I stopped in my tracks, glancing at the closed garage door, the words "special meal" echoing in my head, setting off warning bells. Still, I stood my ground, my stomach churning. "I just want to see Dad, that's all. I haven't even said hello yet." Her face tightened, her grip on the platter visibly tightening. "Sit down and enjoy lunch with me," she said, her voice rising slightly. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, like a command I was expected to obey without question. But the feeling of something terrible lurking beneath her insistence only grew stronger. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "I've had enough of this, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart was racing, my words hanging in the air between us, but I didn't back down. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. We're putting an end to this right now." Her face twisted with panic and desperation flooded her eyes. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she looked at the untouched plate in front of me. "Let's have this meal together. It's important." Ignoring her, I moved toward the garage, determined to get Dad out here, to make him see how far she'd gone. The book had twisted her mind too much, but as I reached for the door, she lunged forward, throwing herself in my path, arms outstretched to block me. Her face was flushed with panic, and her voice was frantic. "Don't go in there. Please, just sit down. Enjoy the meal. Savor it," she begged, her hands trembling as she reached out, practically begging. There was such fear in her voice, not just of me, but of what might be beyond that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held firm, her thin, shaky body the only thing standing between me and the garage. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him." "Dad!" I shouted, my voice rising above hers. At first there was silence. Then from the other side of the door came a low, guttural moan, a horrible, wet gurgle that made my blood run cold. My mother's face went pale, her eyes wide with terror, realizing I'd heard it. A rush of adrenaline surged through me. Before she could react, I shoved her aside and flung the door open. What I saw inside would haunt me forever. I stepped into the garage, my stomach lurching at the sight before me. Dad lay sprawled across his workbench, pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was tightly bound with a belt, acting as a makeshift tourniquet to stop the bleeding. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed flesh where his leg had been severed. Blood pooled beneath him on the cold concrete floor, the dark red staining the area around him in stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent light above. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy and unfocused. His mouth opened, trying to form words, but only a low rasp escaped. "Help! Me!" I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone, dialing 911 as my fingers trembled so badly I could barely tap the numbers. Behind me, I heard my mother's frantic screams as she lunged into the garage, her hands clawing at the air, pleading. "Stop! Please, just sit down. Just have lunch with me," she cried, her voice shrill and high-pitched. Her face twisted in anguish, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't listen. I couldn't. I backed up, putting distance between her and my dad, trying to focus on the dispatcher. "It's my dad. He's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, my voice cracking. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher promised help was on the way and urged me to stay on the line. But my mom's desperate wails filled the garage, creating a haunting echo. She clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp, her words a broken chant. "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I kept my distance, heart pounding, as I watched my mother spiral into a frantic haze. But she never laid a finger on me. Instead, she circled back to the door, wailing and begging in a chilling frenzy that made my blood run cold. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights painting the house in an eerie glow. They rushed into the garage, assessing the situation with practiced efficiency. My mother resisted, her body a tempest of movement as she screamed and flailed. They restrained her quickly, her pleas breaking into incoherent sobs as they led her away. I could barely breathe as I watched them take her, her voice a haunting wail that echoed down the driveway, begging me to come back to the table. Paramedics swarmed in, quickly stabilizing my dad and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed them outside, numb with shock, unable to process what had just happened. In the cold December air, my mind spun, looping over her chilling words and the horrific image of that garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and the familiar comfort of tradition had turned into something unrecognizable, twisted into a nightmare I could never forget. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On the good days, when the painkillers dulled the agony and his mind cleared, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She had been cooking strange, elaborate meals every night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's old recipes, but as the dishes grew more bizarre and disturbing, he began to realize something was terribly wrong. She would mumble to herself while cooking, speaking to someone who wasn't there, her voice barely audible. Eventually, he stopped eating at home altogether, sneaking off to nearby diners, finding any excuse to avoid her food. He admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything after that became a blur, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to intense pain and the sickening reality of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both of us coming to the same terrible conclusion. The book had changed her. My father hesitated to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her obsessive behavior, the frantic gleam in her eyes made him certain. Somehow the book had drawn her in, its dark grip twisting her mind, leading her down a path from which there was no return. By New Year's Eve, my father was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I would stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over what had happened gnawing at me. He accepted the promise, though his eyes spoke of a quiet pain, of a man forever altered by what he had experienced. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. Updates came from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but still disturbing in her words. She admitted to what she'd done to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper as she spoke, her eyes distant, as though she believed this phrase was a sacred mantra, a truth she couldn't escape. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked down toward midnight, my father and I went outside to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book with me, feeling its weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire. The flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had haunted us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only thing keeping me grounded as the smoke rose into the night air, vanishing into the cold. But as the last ember faded, a pang of something like regret twisted in my chest. Later, when I sat alone in front of my computer, staring at the screen, my finger hovered over the file icon on my desktop. The digital copy of the book, the one with every recipe, every hauntingly preserved page, was still there, untouched. I knew I should delete it, wipe every trace of the book from existence, to erase the thing that had broken my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I feared the book still had a hold on me, that maybe somehow it wasn't done with us yet.